this video or this feed. So I'm here representing the Logos organization, but with 100% certainty, the views that I'm going to express to you guys are my own and do not necessarily reflect the organization. Now, I'll introduce myself, but first I want to introduce the topic at hand and the ideas that we are going to end up collectively discussing, which at the end of this talk, you guys will be more than welcome to come and add your opinions or considerations or your counterpoints. I'm good with that. So the world that we're currently in, the world that we're embedded in as a human species, is a world that is embedded in a beautiful kind of catastrophe. One would think that we are in a point of maximum despair and ennui and depression and destructiveness. Some other thinkers, people like Terence McKenna, have considered that we're undergoing a kind of birthing crisis as a species, that we're entering into a type of paradigm shift where there's going to be a massive change in the way that we align ourselves sociologically, technologically, and philosophically. One of my primary concerns about what's happening right now is it's this notion that governments and nation states have begun to spiral out of control in terms of their growth and development. From what it looks like, these governments, specifically the nation states in the first world, the US, the UK, China, various Asian governments, are taking advantage of this quote unquote crisis. You know, the whole quote, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they're turning globalization, or they're using globalization as an opportunity to metamorphose into a kind of one world government, one world controlling apparatus. And this is really evidenced by what's happening with the World Economic Forum and Agenda 2030. If you guys haven't heard about these agendas, they're put together by groups like the United Nations, the G40, the Bilderberger Group. None of this stuff is conspiracy theory oriented. It's all actually based in fact. Now, one of the key goals of Agenda 2030 is what the United Nations calls SDG. It's social developmental growth, or sustainable developmental growth. And one of the interesting facts about SDG is it's not really sustainable, it's not really developmental, and it's not really growth. And actually the G can also stand for goals. I think that's actually how they define it. So they're not really even goals, at least not goals that we would consider beneficial to our plight as crypto-anarchists, to free thinkers, as autonomous individuals. Now, one of the things that these groups are doing soon, I believe in September, actually, they're having what's called the Summit for the Future, a conference where they're going to get together and they're going to have various representatives from all the countries sign a pact for the future. We don't know all the details of what's going to be involved in this pact, but 100% without a doubt, what these guys are doing, right, through Agenda 2030, they have this idea that you will own nothing and that you will be happy. You will eat the bugs and you will be happy. You will eat whatever they tell you to. The idea is that they're trying to eliminate as much autonomy and human sovereignty as possible. They're attempting to control us, control our actions, and control our behaviors. And I really think this is why crypto anarchy, the cypherpunk movement, what we're all doing in the tech space, what voluntarists are doing, is becoming more important, more potent, and more powerful in terms of its movements now, more so than ever. Actually, I'm kind of reminded of the quote by Robert Anton Wilson. He's the author of a book called Prometheus Rising. And he said, on a planet that increasingly resembles one huge maximum security prison, the only intelligent choice is to plan or to stage a jailbreak. So that's what I believe that we're here doing right now as we undergo this crisis, this birthing crisis as a species. Now, I'm going to get more into this idea of a crisis and what these the United Nations and the G40 and Bilderberg Group and all these guys are thinking about doing, what kind of actions they're thinking about taking, but what they're also what they're taking advantage of. But I want to provide a bit of my background, and so you guys can, who the hell is this dude up here talking? Why should he have any say whatsoever in how we understand the world, how we approach crypto-anarchism, how we approach technology? So I came into the crypto ecosystem from an activist background. Back in 2009, I was actually arrested in Texas for possession of MDMA to the tune of about 500 pills and about 30 grams of cocaine. I thought I was going to go to prison for 40 years. They threatened me with 40 years in prison. I was lucky because I didn't have a background, and the drugs and the chemicals didn't cross state lines, so it didn't become a federal charge. But it was this direct interaction with the state that woke me up to the idea that something is undeniably wrong and corrupted about the state of affairs as it concerns our institutions, especially our government. Because in my mind, it wasn't wrong to engage in a free trade that is based on voluntarism and consent on the open market. And it was this path that led me down the anarchist rabbit trail, right down into the rabbit hole, where I started reading people like Murray Rothbard. I read his book For a New Liberty. I read Ayn Rand's Anthem, the dystopian novella. I read during the time period, I was a huge fan of Stefan Molyneux. He kind of switched directions a little bit and is more a supporter of nationalism. But I read his works and I was highly influenced by it. But more importantly, and primarily to our concern, I started hanging out with anarchist groups online. I was perusing Reddit forums and various chat forums, and I came into contact with a group of individuals referring to themselves as crypto-anarchists. It's also around this time, about 2013, when I came into contact with the crypto-anarchists and some cypherpunks, and they were talking about Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency ecosystem. It was at this point that I started talking about the importance of cryptocurrency and technology. And it was around 2015 when I put my money where my mouth is, and I actually engaged into the crypto ecosystem full time, invested in crypto, and also started working in the space. I worked with Roger Ver at Bitcoin.com for 3 years as a communications guy. I was the opinion editor, I was a news writer, and also the communications ambassador. After that, I worked at a cryptocurrency exchange, an OTC boutique called CryptoSpace in the US. Did that for 3 years as well. And more recently, I started working with Logos and working on a vision toward developing infrastructure for a network state. And I primarily do communications for those guys. And I also wrote a book called Dignity and Decency, Rhapsodic Musings of a Modern Anarchist. So that's a bit about me. But my whole emphasis has been on how can we procure more human freedom, not only leveraging philosophy and education, which I think is a vital component of it, but also using technologies that can help, quote unquote, underthrow the state apparatus. And we're going to get more into it. So this discussion is really going to be about the idea of, I call it crypto anarchy, reasons and pathways. So it's going to be about why is crypto anarchy so vital for what we're doing? I'm going to discuss a little bit of its history and a bit of its trajectory and how it leads in or it transforms into what I would call its apotheosis or its final vision, which is the creation and the dissemination of network states or self-sovereign virtual territories. Throughout the first part of this discussion, we're going to look into this crisis that I mentioned that world governments and nation states are trying to take advantage of. It's what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls the meta crisis, but it goes by many different names. It's a meta crisis, a multi-crisis, a poly-crisis, etc. We'll discuss that and how those guys take advantage of it. We'll also discuss whether it's how real or how meaningful the polycrisis is, and how that confers a kind of paradigm shift in the way that we think about governance, the way that we think about structuring how we live our lives and how we relate to each other collectively and economically and socially. Then we'll get into some details. I know that Balaji did a talk with you guys, so I'm assuming everyone has an introduction to the idea of network states. You're all here at Zoo Georgia, so I have a keen understanding that you know the basics of network states and ideas around pop-up cities, special economic zones. We're going to get into some details around network states, its history and its origins in crypto-anarchism, and how not only the purpose of helping to stop these one world government conspirators and things like the United Nations and the US trying to be the policeman of the world. We're going to examine and explore that. We're also going to learn how network states play a pivotal role in helping us opt out or exit from having to deal with these types of systems. Then we're going to get into, so Vitalik, a lot of you guys probably pay very close attention to his blog. He wrote a really amazing piece called My Techno-Optimism. So we're going to balance out some of these ideas around the poly crisis and these alleged crises that beset us. And we're going to look at what he calls defensive accelerationism. And then we'll look at the practical realities and the crypto-anarchist implementation of network states and how I personally believe this type of infrastructure should look and how it can help protect us from dealing with these nation states. I take a bit of a different approach in my thought process from how Balaji thinks about network states. In his book, he mentioned, and I'll just briefly touch on this, we'll talk about it more in a bit, touches on the idea of network states. Part of the definition is they would obtain diplomatic recognition and be recognized by the other states, but I don't think that's necessary and probably not a good thing if we're trying to undermine or incrementally abolish this system that has caused so much harm and so much degradation over time. And then finally, if there's time, we're going to get into a section on future visions. This is a section on where we're actually headed, what that vision looks like sociologically, technologically, and we'll draw inspiration from people like Terence McKenna and Kevin Kelly and even Ray Kurzweil. Cool. So the poly crisis, let's jump right in and discuss this. So a poly crisis is a crisis that consists of overlapping issues and problems that affect our survivability as a species. And one of the endemic traits of the poly crisis is it's a situation that we can't fully grasp or understand because it involves deep time, concepts of deep time, meaning the problems are going to last so long that they scale well beyond the time horizon of our own individual lives. And they're also extremely complex in the way that they manifest in the Anthropocene and in terms of how humans are impacting these types of issues. So just to name a few, for examples, The emergence of artificial intelligence and the possibility of superintelligence is one that people discuss a lot. Climatological change, climate change, whether it's created and manifested by humans or whether it's natural phenomenon, is an issue. Also, oceanic changes, oceanic pollution, disruption of oceanic ecosystems is another one. Technological advancement in general, blockchain, cryptocurrency, communication technologies, radioactive nuclear waste. This is another issue. So there's all these mounting crises that could potentially impact, again, our survivability as a species. It could also impact the way that we organize sociologically and politically. Now, here's why I want to discuss the poly crisis and get a bit deeper into what this means and how we can anticipate change. Because I think we either go one of two directions. We either go toward this one world sort of totalitarian dystopia that the United Nations and the G40 and these guys are thinking about for us, but because they believe that they can solve these problems, right? And they're using these various crises to bolster and to underpin their agenda. So an interesting foci of the poly crisis is what Timothy Morton calls, where he refers to them as hyper objects. A hyper object is an object that has become so broad and so deep, as I've mentioned, that it moves beyond our immediate understanding, and it creates gaps in our knowledge, right? And so what happens when there's a hyper object, and let's just use let's use the idea of ocean pollution and new sciences around oceanography, right, as a hyper object. So people used to think, and this is something that Schmachtenberger has talked about in his work over at the Consilience Project, and I really recommend you guys to go and check out his work. It's consilienceproject.org, and there's a lot of really good articles, and I find the reading really informative, especially from because I'm more of a techno optimist. I assume all of you guys are as well. We're deeply embedded in the techno ecosystem, and he has a lot of critiques and criticisms around techno optimism and the ecological future of our species. And I think it's really valuable to read his stuff. It's very well written and insightful. 100%, I don't agree with everything that he says, and I would not expect that you will either. But one of the things that is discussed here in terms of the ocean is that we just used to think about the ocean as a place where it's an extractable resource, right? We can fish, we can leverage the ocean to develop various kinds of generators, hydroelectric energy. It simply exists and it's there for us to use, right? It's an extractable object. But what's happened in recent decades is the ocean has become really a sensorium. We have placed an array of sensors and our abilities to quantify the ocean and its activities has increased. And what we're trying to understand is how various kinds of pollution, like the oil spill, I think that happened in 2010 or 2011, how all of these oceanic disturbances, right, that are sometimes human created, sometimes not, have and will impact us over the long term. And this is what Morton called a hyper object, because we can't fully understand its full scope. And so what's happened as a result of this, it's created a kind of non-kinetic online warfare. You guys are all on Twitter. We're in crypto Twitter. We spend a lot of our time debating and discussing topics, questioning whether quote unquote science is settled or not. And because we have an indeterminacy in our knowledge, we don't have full understanding of the scope of these things, where most people either fall on one side of the camp or the other. They're either hardcore for or against, right? Let's just use climate change or ocean pollution, or the heat or the relative climate of the ocean. Is it changing? Is it increasing? Does it matter? Is it not? Is this all propaganda that's being spread so that these guys can exercise more control over us? So this is a really interesting topic. The idea of a hyperobject is it creates a situation where we're constantly at war with each other because of a lack of understanding, and because there's so much asymmetric informational warfare that it creates what's been called epistemic nihilism. There's a term going around online that you guys may be familiar with called being black-pilled, right? This idea that there's so many things happening at once, I can't keep track, that everything seems to be falling apart. So I enter into a state of despair and depression and ennui, and I can't function anymore. So this is like being black-pilled. I have cognitive overload. There's just too much to take in. So the point that I'm trying to make here is again going back to this initial story of governments using these crises, using these knowledge gaps and this indeterminacy of knowledge to engage in divide and conquer tactics to keep us split. You see, because one of the things that I consider a valuable insight is that if these crises, whether they're real or imagined, they are continuously used in a provocative manner to stir up negative thoughts in the imagination of the everyman, which creates a scenario where we're more likely to battle and fight it out with each other. So one of the solutions that Daniel Schmachtenberger and his ilk recommend to helping alleviate these concerns is to have more epistemological humility, right? Because a lot of times we tend to think in terms of absolutes. It's either, and also it works like this in media because people have an expectation that quote unquote the science is settled in any given direction, and that the understanding that we have has to be complete. Part of this, I think, is also Freudian-esque egotistical drives, right, and defense mechanisms that we have as human beings. We want things to be a certain way, and oftentimes we will try to confirm our own biases, right? Again, whether true or false. So having epistemic humility, right, and wanting to be open-minded to learning more is an important piece of this process. And we're going to get to this in the next section, where we're going to actually talk about our solution in the form of crypto-anarchy. But the idea is that if we have epistemological humility, we're able to create different kinds of solutions and governance solutions that allow us to overcome these problems without having to defer to a centralized authority or a centralized planner. Before I move on to the discussion of our solution in the form of crypto-anarchy, I do want to mention one last thing in terms of these issues around the poly crisis. And one of the contributing factors to issues as they emerge is what Schmachtenberger referred to as Moloch dynamics, which are game theoretic scenarios where our institutions, and especially governments, attempt to solve some kind of problem. But what happens when they solve that problem, they're solving for maximization of local optima, right? So if it's an institution or a company, they're spinning out a widget, right, to maximize the profit motive or whatever their game plan or their business strategy is. But what happens is there's unforeseen collateral consequences as a result of that has downstream negative impacts, be it environmental, be it cultural, social, whatever it may be. This attempt to solve for local optima causes problems that resonate throughout history. So one of the reasons that we're not entering into these crises scenario is because of playing these Moloch games. And just a bit of background on the idea of Moloch. Moloch is a child sacrificing god from the Hebrew Bible, right? That's where the name comes from. Another element of this game theoretic scenario is an idea of the Red Queen race, which plays into Moloch dynamics. And the Red Queen race, which comes directly from Lewis Carroll's work, right, Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland. It's the idea that we're constantly in a competition, and if we're constantly in a competition, then we're trying to achieve. It's a zero-sum game where we're trying to achieve more than the other guy, and we're trying to win out over the competition. But we end up not actually creating or producing anything of value, or we end up losing in some way. So an example of that, of a Red Queen race, is two research scientists who are incentivized to produce as much research as possible, and they do that so they can expand their credibility, right? And they constantly produce this information over and over and over again. This research, they're engaging in the research, they're producing papers, scientific journals, but at the end of the day, they're defrauding people because they're trying to race to produce this information, or they actually don't get funding for their next project, even though they're producing all of this material. So this is what happens in not only a Moloch game, but in a Red Queen race, which is how our current institutions are set up and how they've evolved over time. So let's get into the solution space now. And the reason why we're all here, and this is to, at least for my talk, is to discuss the idea of crypto anarchy. So again, we have this enduring crisis that we're facing that's multifaceted, multi-generational, and it has also given rise to more centralized planning, more authoritarianism, and more control over our individual lives. So I think it's a lot easy for people to be black-pilled, for them to just throw their hands up and to say, I give. But as technological thinkers and tinkerers, we've decided to take another direction, and that is to approach these problems from the space of crypto anarchism, right? And crypto anarchism, of course, is the idea that we want to gain more individual autonomy, more individual freedom by leveraging technologies that potentially undermine or underthrow the nation state apparatus. But interestingly, by doing this, we also create the necessary and sufficient conditions to solve other problems, right? Because these scenarios of creating a crypto anarchist society allow us to overcome negative game theoretic scenarios where we enter Red Queen races and where we're engaging in Moloch dynamics, right? Because we change the structure of the game by not abiding by the dictates of a centralized authority. So let's talk I want to get briefly into the history of crypto anarchism, where it comes from. Won't talk too much about this, I assume most people here are familiar with it. So the term came into fashion in the 1990s when the cypherpunk and crypto anarchist Timothy May wrote the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. And that manifesto is a clarion call. It is a beacon for technologists to develop technologies that have strong anonymity and privacy preserving guarantees. And embedded in this is also the idea that crypto anarchists do whatever they can to decentralize their technologies, to prevent centralized honeypots and authorities from growing too large and too formidable for us to undermine, and which would allow them to therefore control us using violence and coercion in ways that we don't appreciate and that we have a tendency to push back against. So Timothy May, by the way, he was influenced very strongly by the work of Ayn Rand, right, who wrote Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and who was a fan of the entrepreneurial spirit and the importance of capitalism. He was also a fan and was influenced by Murray Rothbard, who was a libertarian thinker and also coined the term anarcho-capitalism. But there are some other players involved in crypto-anarchism that were doing work at the same time as Timothy May. During the 90s, there was a historical event that some people are familiar with, but some are not, called the cypherpunk wars or the crypto wars or cipher wars. And one of the defining characteristics of the 90s is that the public didn't have access to a strong cryptography. We didn't have access to public private key cryptography. And most of that was hoarded and hidden from the public by various government agencies and alphabet soup boys in the United States. It was only with the work of Whitfield Diffie, who was a cryptographer and an early crypto-anarchist, and Marty Hellman, who not only discovered some work that the government agencies had attempted to hide, but they also, of course, put that work together and created their own variation of public-private key cryptography, which now bears also their namesake. So it was actually the crypto-anarchists and the cypherpunks who initially won this crypto war against the government by liberating public-private key cryptography and ushering in this age of cryptographic pursuits and technological pursuit of undermining and underthrowing the nation state apparatus. So just a few key principles and purposes behind crypto anarchy. So I mentioned the privacy and anonymity guarantees, but crypto anarchists are very strong proponents of generating and guaranteeing political freedom and economic freedom. And a more common thread or recent thread in crypto anarchist pursuit is the idea of decentralization, right? Creating more decentralized structures because they're more impervious to attacks, right? They disavow the idea of creating honeypots that act as single points of failure for hackers and attackers and government agents. Now, one of my good friends, and I really recommend reading a couple of his books. His name's Max Borders. He wrote a book called Underthrow. He also wrote a book called After Collapse. But in his book Underthrow, he outlines this idea that crypto anarchists have been a fan of for a long time, and that I'm a personal fan of. And it's this idea of incrementally underthrowing the state, right? Or using peaceful or nonviolent resistance through technological means to compromise their ability to control us. The famous activist Gandhi had a similar idea that he referred to as satyagraha, right? This notion of peaceful resistance or peaceful defense. So what crypto anarchists, what we've created is a form of digital satyagraha, right? Digital satyagraha, where we're using technology to push back against the nation states. And I know that there's an element of this idea that can be pretty controversial, right? Because not everyone in the space that we're in wants to be so overtly and so emphatically anti-system, right? Because they're afraid that the government will come after them. There's these chilling effects that have been created that attempt to stop developers and technologists from engaging in crypto anarchic pursuits. So the beautiful thing here is that at the end of the day, they can't stop the signal. They can't stop us from pushing this technology forward and pursuing it. I think we're going to, right? Also, when you, there's this idea of psychological reactance, when you try to stop people from doing something by insinuating that it's taboo, they react against that, have a tendency to move toward the thing that you're trying to stop, right? So I think it's okay if we have fears and concerns around building crypto anarchic tools, but I think that we should also have the spinal fortitude and the wherewithal to develop these technologies, because our future is at stake, right? Not only do we have the poly crisis, but we have the governmental apparatus trying to control the narrative, trying to control us and our societies and our implementations of technologies. And if we don't try to react against that, we're going to put ourselves in a bad position. So I think it is incumbent upon us as technologists and as thinkers, as free thinkers, to fight back against this particular system. This means using our speech, right? Like I'm doing right now to talk about these ideas, but also as coders and developers for you guys to actually develop and build these technologies to fight back. There's something honorable and desirable in that, and I think we should pursue it with gusto. This is the apotheosis of what our species is capable of in terms of resisting an apparatus that could necessitate our downfall. Now, speaking of apotheosis, so this is where I think what you guys at ZuVillage, right, and just the Zuzalu movement in general are massively a part of, and it's this idea of creating a network state. So just recently, I actually updated the Wikipedia page for crypto-anarchism, and I added a massive section. You can actually go look at the Wikipedia entry for crypto-anarchism, and I added the network state section to that, because a lot of people don't realize it out of the gate, but the idea of network states are a direct offshoot of crypto-anarchism. It is a continuation of the crypto-anarchist spirit. And let me provide the evidence for why that's the case, because a lot of people don't know this. So Timothy May, aside from writing the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto in around 1992, he also wrote a piece called Libertaria in Cyberspace, or Cyber Libertaria. And in this particular article, and you can Google that right now, or you can look it up, he makes the case that we're eventually going to create self-selected evolutionary states, self-sustaining states that exist wholly in cyberspace and have those crypto-anarchist ideals built into it, particularly the privacy and the anonymity features, right? So that, as Werner Vinge said, our true names cannot be easily discovered. So Balaji, I admire his work and his book. I think it's it's fantastic. He coined the term network state, proper credit where credit is due. But it is certainly true that this idea had existed in the minds of crypto anarchists prior to Balaji's work, right? So aside from Timothy May, Jerry Everhard, who's a well-known cypherpunk and crypto anarchist, wrote a book called Virtual States. And in this book, he makes the case that virtual states will emerge to supplant, or at least allow us to exit, right? Exit the nation state apparatus and create our own governance environment, or our own governance model or structure. Now, I want to back up just a little bit. So we see, I think we've pieced together the historical prerequisites for network states and cyber libertarian is thoroughly embedded in the crypto anarchist ideal. But the ideas have even gone further back than technologists. So the famous German economist who actually escaped the Nazis and came to the US, Albert O. Hirschman, wrote a book called Voice, Exit, and Loyalty. And I think this book sets the precedent for what we're trying to do with network states, right? What Hirschman attempts to articulate in the book is that a lot of us, when we don't like the governing apparatus and the powers that be, the first thing that we try to do is we try to voice our concern. And we do this through protestation. We do this through engaging in the political process, the democratic process, by getting our elected official into office and creating change. But in a completely corrupted system, right? You guys are familiar with Frank Herbert's work on Dune, this idea that power attracts pathological personalities. It's not that absolute power corrupts. It's just that they attract and are magnetic to the corruptible. So exercising voice in these types of systems is ultimately counterintuitive, right? How can we change a system that's broken? It'd be like trying to get into the mafia, right? La Cosa Nostra, and attempting to work our way up to the top to become the Don, right? With an idea for creating change. But if the bones and the body and the firmament of that organization is thoroughly corrupted and based in violence, are you actually going to be able to create change within it? Probably unlikely. So the other option is to exercise loyalty to that system, right? That's just agree with the status quo and the state of things and not try to rock the boat. Obviously, we don't agree with that position, but that is part of this tripartite idea of voice, exit, and loyalty. Now, the final part, which is the part that we're interested in, is being able to exit, right? So Hirschman states that when you have a system, an institution, or a firm, or a government that refuses to change, is totally corrupted, or otherwise not serving the needs of the public or the people, you exit those systems and you create your own. So this was a huge influence and inspiration, I think, on early network thinking, on early business thinking, and especially when it comes to dealing with corruption in governments. I'm going to go back a little further. Something else that is also not readily discussed in terms of the historicity of the network state movement is this idea of panarchy, right? And I know, guys, there's going to be a bit of an informational overload, and some of this stuff I'm going to gloss over. So please feel free to write things down, to take notes, or to look the stuff up so you can get more information, because this certainly is a broad bird's eye level overview of a lot of this material. So this idea of panarchy, there was a paper written in 1860 by Paul-Émile Dupuit. Remember, this is 1860. This is during a revolutionary time period when democracy is really being re-envisioned, right? This Lockean theory of contractual arrangements and social contracts and all these ideas are coming to the forefront during the Enlightenment. Panarchy was way ahead of its time. It's the idea of, to put it in simple terms, it's non-territorial exit. It's the ability to exit the governance services or the governance arrangement in a physical territory without having to physically relocate, right? So Paul-Émile Dupuit, in his paper in 1860, this was before modern communication technologies, clearly. So his thought was that there would be this directorate, this institution or this bureaucracy that a person could go to physically. They would show up, they would sign some paperwork, and they would opt in to the governance service of their choice. So there would be a market of competing governance services that a person could opt into and they could choose to engage with, right? And hopefully that these governance services would share their values, right? If they wanted more freedom, then these government services would reflect that. If they wanted to live under a totalitarian regime, well, certainly they could do that as well with this panarchic initiative. So panarchy is a meta-political philosophical theory on how governance should work. It doesn't say anything about the contents or the contractual arrangements within these governance models. So what we see here is a very early philosophical consideration of what we now refer to as network states, right? Or what was called virtual states or self-sovereign virtual territories. Now, let me get into just a definition. I'm sure Balaji defined his vision of network states for you, but under the aegis of his perspective, the network state is first formed as an online community that shares values or shares a one commandment, right? This is in his book. You can go check out his book, The Network State. And then down the road, if that particular community wants to, they can crowdfund territory, start living together physically with their governance structure in place as well, right? Now, a key element of Balaji's vision, at least that's cited in the book and is part of the definition, is the idea that these network states would maybe at some point seek to gain diplomatic recognition as a relevant state. In my perspective, or my views as more crypto-anarchist, is the idea that we should create these network states to underthrow, right, Max Border's idea, or to incrementally abolish or undermine the nation state, which is a very crypto-anarchic ideal, right? But more important is, even if that doesn't happen, we have to protect ourselves from these governments as they begin to impinge on our activities. So being able to fully exit and then have cryptographic privacy guarantees embedded into that, and enough decentralization to protect ourselves from threats and to organize digitally and then maybe physically if we want to, with those proper defenses in place to where we never have to gain diplomatic recognition and we can live as freely and as autonomously as possible. So there's another element of network states that's not discussed a lot, and I'm going to get into that, and then we're going to go into, let's see, how much time do I have? I think a good amount of time, so this is good. Okay, so there is an element of network states that is similar to the ideals in panarchy. And this is this notion that network states will compete in an open market of governance. So one of the major problems with nation-state governance models or nation-state governments is that they don't have to compete on a market. They are not subject to market failure. And why is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. So governments, as you probably are all well aware of, can extract and expropriate the wealth of the population, right, by taxing the population. So they effectively steal money from the population as much as they want over time. This prevents the government apparatus from having to compete and having to adjust their services to what the market needs. Instead, they compel their people to live in accordance with their whims, with their wills, and with their desires. So it's coercive in nature, and it's antithetical to market activity and to what the Austrians called catalactics. Catalactics being the price signals that get set in the form of discovery, price discovery on the market. The other point of this is that governments have access to a quasi-privatized cartel of central bankers who can effectively press a big red button, right, and print out as much money as they want to, right? And this This ability to print out as much money as they want means that they have access to and control over the currency. Again, which was a reason, we won't get into all the philosophy of Bitcoin and why Bitcoin was originally created, but this was part of the original impetus, was to free money and allow financial sovereignty and financial responsibility to be embraced by the individual. So what's ultimately happening here with network states is that we're offering a competitive governance solution of any kind to emerge and to compete with the nation state. This is what I'm just calling network agorism. Network agorism. So agorism as a phrase, as a term, was coined by Samuel Edward Konkin III. And it's just the idea that we should purposely create black markets, or black markets will emerge, or circular economies will emerge that allow trades to happen outside the scope of the governmental apparatus. In other words, the government can't impact or affect this black-gray circular economy. They don't have the ability to reach and attack it. Now, conversely, they actually do and can, right? You've seen governments go after darknet markets. They notoriously went after the Silk Road, right? They got Ross. They put Ross in prison, double life sentence. Unfortunate. He should be freed immediately, by the way. But other markets as well have been attacked. So these were attempts at agorist circular economies. But nonetheless, they have not been able to stop these markets in their entirety, and they will exist in perpetuity, although they have adapted their ways. They've become more splintered, right? They have become more decentralized. There's a multitude of local markets that are attempting to fight back, right, against the state apparatus and allow people to trade freely. So network agorism, I think where we're headed into the future is we're going to create these network states, right? And they're going to compete against the government. And my view is that they're going to, over time, incrementally abolish or underthrow the state apparatus, because the state will not be able to compete, or another way to put it is they may be forced to compete, which means they won't be able to be dictatorial and authoritarian anymore. Instead, they're going to have to embrace actual market principles. They're going to have to embrace sound currencies. They're not going to be able to extort the population or expropriate, because the guys over here are going to do it better. So this is where I see us evolving. This is what we're evolving toward. And I'm going to get back into how this plays into the poly crisis in a moment, right? And maybe I'll mention it briefly here, and we can talk more about it toward the end. But one of the reasons that we're embedded in this multitudinal crises, and we're beset by all these crises, is because governments don't have to address market concerns, right? They behave in a manner that's befitting sociopaths and the corrupt individuals that work within the halls of power. What this means is that they're constantly and perpetually embedded in Moloch dynamics. They're optimizing locally, which is for tax revenue and the maximization of power, which is the actual worst case scenario for Moloch dynamics and game theoretic negative externalities. So this is the twofold reason, and this is the key takeaway of this talk, right? This is a twofold reason for the importance of network states. And I wrote this down, and I'm going to read this to you. So there's the two parts is, one, to provide humanity with decentralization and freedom to confront and solve the poly crisis and generate numerous innovative solutions. So this is actually a credit to Balaji, who mentioned that a network state could form around this one commandment. So whether your one commandment is to solve climate change, if you believe that's a problem, oh, look, you can do it. And you don't have to engage in all this bickering and disagreement with people who don't agree with you. Now you have the governance, you have the funding, the tokenization, the network state to do that, right? You see where the solution space is now for the poly crisis with networks. Network states undermine and solve the game theoretic zero-sum game scenario that we find ourselves in. Now, number two is that network states incrementally abolish governments. So, because governments exacerbate the polycrisis through perpetual engagement, like I said, in Moloch dynamics. So we're not only achieving our crypto-anarchist vision for a freer future, but we're also beginning to solve for these right. And we see this right now, and I meant to mention the precursors to network states, which are pop-up cities, special economic zones, smart cities, right? The Titus Goebel idea, who's involved in Vitalia and Prospera and Rotan, right? And so Nick Azinger and those guys at Vitalia, this is to speak to the importance of how we're working around Moloch dynamics. Vitalia and the DAO that exists there is specifically built to allow the proliferation of biomedical sciences, biotech engineering, to achieve Brian Johnson's dream of human perpetual longevity and long life without having to deal with the complete nightmare of bureaucratic regulations and the FDA involved in trying to push these ideas forward. Yes, they're going to self-regulate. There's still going to be some local governmental regulations. The US is still probably going to try to be involved, but the idea and the vision is clear. It's to route around Moloch dynamics, and it is to solve for one particular problem that Timothy Morton may have construed as a quote unquote hyper object that we don't fully understand, and that we've engaged in non-kinetic warfare trying to solve for. Sweet. So I'm going to take, I think I have like 30 minutes left. And I had a section dedicated to techno-optimism, but I think my techno-optimism is embedded in this. I just want to briefly mention, I was really inspired by Vitalik. He wrote a piece called My Techno-Optimism, which is based on an article written by Andreessen Horowitz, just called Techno-Optimism. That was also a really fantastic read. So I recommend reading those two pieces. I think they embrace the spirit of what we're trying to do as crypto-anarchists, but I won't get into much more details because I want to talk a bit about the practical implications of network states and we'll call it crypto-panarchy, or what may call the cyber libertaria. So one of the huge problems that we have right now is that all these pop-up cities exist, right? Vitalia exists. We have these DAOs that are helping to tokenize and to create governance structures and models around these free cities, right? Or these cities that may have a host government. Also special economic zones, or even places that are not traditional special economic zones, places like Zomia that James C. Scott discussed in his book, The Art of Not Being Governed. All these places they exist, but they don't have a technological governance solution necessarily. Mostly they're controlled by regulations that are imputed by the host governments, or they're self-regulating, or they're kind of trying to use a DAO in whatever way possible. But one of the big issues or the constraints that these pop-up cities have is that they don't have a true network state that underpins them. And when I say true network state, I'm referring to the crypto libertaria vision, or the cyber libertaria vision that Timothy May had. What this means is the infrastructure isn't complete. There's a lot of decentralization theater. So there's a lot of centralization that still exists in these institutions, right? We know that, for instance, we can talk about data, right? We can talk about data and data control, data centralization, the fact that Amazon and Google control most of the data. They have vast data warehouses. Everything is centralized. Most people have connections to these centralized databases. Web3 front ends are notoriously connected to these data centers. Furthermore, a lot of the tokens and the tokens that are involved in these DAOs are all completely transparent. There's no privacy guarantees. So the element of crypto anarchism and really the pure definitional focus of network states is missing from our pop-up cities, from our special economic zones. So this is another thrust of this talk. We have to figure out a way to create infrastructure that allows us to build in the dark. So first, I want to give props to some people who are working diligently on this problem. So a lot of you are familiar with DarkFi and Amir Taki. Those guys are ardent proponents and defenders of implementing tech to bolster and enhance our crypto anarchist agenda. They have whole videos dedicated to this idea that they're referring to creating the dark forest or a dark forest infrastructure. And what the dark forest it implies is it's a canopy, it's a treed canopy that exists in pure darkness, so cyber guerrillas can work in the dark without having to worry about nation states or other bad actors attempting to sabotage their work or to come after them personally, right? As is the case with Samurai Wallet, Tornado Cash, etc. So those guys are working on developing a smart contract-based infrastructure, right, that will allow us to develop these technologies. And I want to be clear here that I love their work, but none of the organizations or institutions that I'm going to mention, this isn't a shill fest for those particular organizations. I'm just educating you guys on the space and what's happening if you're unfamiliar with it and who's kind of starting to work on these problems. It does not mean they're going to be successful. They are not the de facto end all be all in the developmental space for network states. So another organization, and I'll briefly talk about what we're doing at Logos. So we're working on infrastructure that is really a tripartite infrastructure for developing more anonymized, more secure, more private, and more defensive for the development of network states. And the three parts are: one is Codex. Codex is for decentralized data, right? It's a data durability engine that is leveraging things like erasure coding, right? Erasure coding and compression proofs to allow for economies of scale to emerge in a decentralized fashion for data storage. Because that's a huge, in my opinion, that's one of the greatest weaknesses we have right now in the network space and the crypto anarchic. What we have in this area is actually a lot of decentralization theater, right, rather than actual decentralization. The other part is the most well-known is Waku, which is peer-to-peer private communication. Organizations and technologies like Railgun actually use Waku to facilitate peer-to-peer and private communications. And then the last one, which is the newer piece of the Logos technology stack, is Nomos, which is the application layer, the consensus layer, where people will actually be able to build network state applications. There's other organizations working on problems, even platforms like MegaETH or infrastructure projects like MegaETH, which are promising 100,000 TPS, 100,000 throughput for Ethereum. It's a layer 2 solution, and they have actually said they want people to try to build network state applications on top of it. I have some concerns, of course, around privacy and anonymity and actual crypto anarchist implementations there, but that is an idea. There's also an organization called Galactica at galactica.com who are building what they're calling a cipher state, right? So they're trying to build infrastructural apparatus for development of the similar technologies. But I think the main point that I want to bring to bear is we have the precursors to network states, which are the special economic zones, the pop-up cities, etc. But though they don't harbor the pure crypto-anarchic ideology and philosophical vision that would necessitate the application and the development of network states under the way that I see it, right? So it's not in line with what Jerry Eberhard called a virtual state, and it's not in line with what Timothy May called cyber libertarian. I know this may be a controversial point that I'm making during this talk, but this is, I think, really important, especially if and I think Vitalik would agree as well. I know that he's mentioned the importance of building anonymity and privacy tools and enhancing that, and his whole modus operandi for creating ZuVillage, especially Georgia, right, was this idea of furthering the crypto-anarchist agenda, right, and bringing as many talented minds and visionaries and mavericks and iconoclasts together to solve these problems. Now, I saved a part. I think that's probably going to be good. I touched a bit on the practical ramifications. Full disclaimer: I'm not a coder or a developer. I'm purely in the thought space, right? And I'm interested in the philosophical ramifications of the work. But I've been working in technology for a long time, so I have an understanding of it. But this is the general trajectory, I think, of where we're headed. We're actively trying to build network states under the crypto-anarchist vision. For those purposes that I mentioned, I want to mention the key takeaway again. Purpose of network states are twofold. One, provide humanity with decentralization and freedom to confront and solve the poly crisis, to generate numerous innovative solutions, right? So this change of paradigm in governance is the solution to this impending polycrisis and these knowledge gaps. Embedded in the network state idea is knowledge indeterminacy, where there's dedicated focus to solving one problem while provisioning human freedom, because we know that human freedoms and markets are essential to moving fast, quote unquote, breaking things, and then solving some of the most pressing problems of our times. So number two is also to incrementally abolish governments, because governments are trying to consolidate their power in the form of a one world style government, right? Agenda 2030, World Economic Forum, you will own nothing, you will be happy, you will eat the bugs, you will be our undifferentiated serfs, like living in the collective in like in Ayn Rand's vision and Anthem, where you just have a number. The word I doesn't even exist. It's been completely eliminated. So what we're doing with networks is attempting to push back against that. And in my opinion, if we're not building out network states to push back against this apparatus of control, then we're doing a disservice to the overarching goal of what we're building, and we're certainly not helping to alleviate global concerns around the world. Whether you agree with those or not, as you see, I think I made the point that it's irrelevant. If you don't agree with it, you join a network state that's working on something that you are passionate and you care about. So there's ways to manage this, but at the end of the day, we exit the system first. Hopefully we incrementally abolish it, and then we create a more crypto-anarchic future. So I think there's a play of both technology and ideology at work here. So cool. I think, yeah, I spoke a lot. I have this whole section on future visions, but that's potentially a lot. So I want to have time for questions, discussions, debates. You hate what I have to say. You love what I have to say. I'd like to open up the discussion now, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Sterlin. Yeah, we don't have a ton of time, but can you hear me? Is it working?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. But I do want to respond and ask a question. I think I was already thinking about this, but then how you ended also especially sparked this. So you talked quite a bit about Malachian dynamics, and also mentioned ZuVillage as potentially a role model, or we're moving in the right directions. But I would argue that certainly from the start in Montenegro, we've been seeing these Malachian dynamics play out. We've had different forces such as attention, people maybe pushing for attention economy or status seekers, or even globalists and different people coming in and trying to capture it for their own thing, arguably differing ideologies. One of the different camps, or some of the different directions that started pushing and pulling in Montenegro that continued in subsequent events, and we're even seeing differences of opinions here, are people that argue that we should scale as quickly as possible, and this is why, and we should make it accessible for everybody, and we can do this and that, and then get to 1,000, 10,000, 20,000, etc. And then other forces arguing, no, we should be focused and focus on quality. We shouldn't enshrine the people that happened to be in Montenegro last year. However, trying to scale very quickly has a lot of potential consequences. And of course, there's very compassionate ways of understanding people pushing for scaling, and then there's also the more paranoid ways of looking at people that are pushing for scaling as quickly as possible, that also happen to have a very global solution that would then very perfectly allow these exits that are not really exits. And as I mentioned, right, so there's in some ways all the people that happen to be in Montenegro, then suddenly there's this idea of trying to enshrine exactly those people as saying, well, we are the community, we're the citizen, we make decisions for forever. Yet of course, not everybody that was there, even in my experience, I was surprised when I would meet people and they would say, what experiment? If I asked them what about the experiment was interesting to them. So it kind of became clear over time that not everybody was actually there in this idea of something larger. In the time since, I've also seen patterns of what also, so maybe, the less paranoid, but a more understandable idea of this mass scaling is it seems like people see this as a new industry. Okay, the pop-up city industry TM, and now I'm going to establish myself as I am a pop-up city organizer and I'm a professional at this, and I can do it here and here and here and here. And so it's another direction that I think has, at worst, it's just distracting from some of the larger ambitions or goals that at least I thought I was signing up into by joining ZuVillage, but then maybe, or what did I say, at worst or at best? Like maybe at best it's a distraction, at worst then it's actually making it difficult to impossible to pursue anything larger like a network state, etc. So if you're familiar, I'm not sure how familiar you are, that due to different political turmoil that happened in the fall of last year, especially around two questions of who is a citizen of ZuVillage and where would ZuVillage 2024 be, then for 2024, it was decided to decentralize, where there'd be no singleton official event for this year, and the answer to who is a citizen would not yet be answered. It's still on the table that maybe this happens in 2025, or all of these different decentralized forks, you could call them, then just continue in their own directions. It's more a network in some ways, and people can vote with their feet. There's still a lot of overlap of people going to all of the events this year, by all means. And one benefit that I've seen, especially in co-initiating ZuVillage Georgia, is that, thank you, in co-initiating ZuVillage Georgia, is that I think then it allows, the forks allow people that want to do mass scaling or want to be more, sometimes we call it like the Burning Man style of a pop-up city, or just going in a somewhat different direction, maybe less technically focused, not cypherpunk, more about community or communal living, let alone scaling as quickly as possible. They can do their own thing. We can then focus on what we're really serious about, which, as you know, we wrote laying the foundations for a transnational techno-optimist network, or so at least trying to move in that direction. And I think that it's been helpful that people that were really turned off by that, it seems, did not come because they had other options. It's not like this was the only option of something inspired by and with a lot of people from ZuVillage, but they could also go to different ones if they weren't spoken to in that way. We changed a few variables with this experiment, in that we added a pre-orientation and a first week dedicated to rationality, meta-rationality, individual cognitive sovereignty, and then collective sense-making. And we actually did discuss and try to practice epistemic humility before jumping into anything else, because that's something that at least my co-initiator and I, we saw as some of the pitfalls of ZuVillage, was jumping into, we're a collective, now let's make decisions and let's all agree with each other and have vibes lives in harmony, but without protecting the individual cognitive sovereignty. We were also invited to ZuVillage through the rationality community. And so I think that's what also primed us of, okay, well, there's people from all these other verticals, but we're bringing with the rationality if we're representing anything that's there. And then our next week was actually on defensive accelerationism and existential risk, some cypherpunk, techno-optimism, and then we had decentralized governance and legal engineering. And then that brought us to this week where we're finally discussing network states. So we, instead of jumping into those conversations from the beginning, we tried to have material and discussions and at least some shared knowledge and some amount of culture of disagreeing with each other and debating and being able to criticize without worrying about rocking the boat before getting to this week, where now we're starting to discuss, okay, what are we trying to do? Is there going to be governance? Is that going to include the people that are here? Or are we going to create something that people can then opt into and others that don't agree can go elsewhere? So that's all of this context that I wanted to share about the experiment you're calling into. And again, thank you. I think a lot of what you were saying very much resonates, and I think it complements well hearing from others today along the spectrum for network states. What I'm really curious about, if you could speak to, and I know we're a bit over time, so we can go quickly. You do say Logos is actively trying to build network states, and I do get the sense that we're very aligned in actively trying to build it, especially with the tech, with being very focused. I mean, we used status up until about a week before the event began because it just practically wasn't possible anymore, but we were pushing through it until we could. And our main scheduling system is so dedicated to being decentralized that of course the UX is not ideal, but we figure that's what we can a bit offer, is actually pushing through the friction. And we are being very expressive of being cypherpunk, or what is cypherpunk and why are we trying to actually be cypherpunk and be privacy focused. You have to ask permission before taking a photo, let alone before publishing a photo, etc. But so where the question is I'm curious how maybe Malachian dynamics have been playing out in Logos or in different your experience in other areas of cypherpunk worlds, because it's nice to think, okay, here's the exit strategy, but we're all humans, we all have human nature, and then if the incentives are wrong, then everyone's going to, it's just, there's going to be a single honeypot, there's going to be people grappling for wherever the power or status is to grab. And then I'm also curious if Logos is experimenting in IRL meet space with extended gatherings the way that ZuVillage model is doing, and trying to build this idea of a network state, but also then having a lot of people together, which then maybe causes all the drama and maybe we don't get to network state. I don't know. Anyway, thank you for listening and thank you for sharing. I'm excited to hear some of your
amazing thoughts, Veronica. So I'll start with to answer your question about whether Logos is experimenting with these in-person or any in real life meet space type of events or gatherings. No, not yet. The organization is primarily focused on trying to ship the technology. That's been one of the biggest pieces. So one of the things that's interesting about Logos, I think the Malachian dynamics have a tendency to crop up and emerge in any kind of organization, especially if the dynamics are more fluid, where you have some centralization, you have some decentralization. So one of the things that I like about Logos is that there's a huge focus, and this is directly out of textbook Timothy May's ideology, this idea of rapid evolution and experimentation and self-selection. So we do a lot of that in the organization, where if things aren't working, we rapidly evolve that and try something different, right, to change those dynamics a bit and see if that solves those particular problems. And so far that's worked quite well, in my opinion. Obviously all the time in any organization things can get better and they can improve, but certainly you want to do whatever you can to mitigate those Malachian dynamics, and they usually only emerge with more centralization, with more command of power. So the more that you allow people to kind of self-select for their own activities and work at their own pace, you have a tendency to subdue that corruption mechanism that Malachian dynamics tends to produce. Now, in terms of what you guys are working on, and I can see how these kind of dynamics would emerge, especially in intentional capture, in people wanting to be the boss of ZuVillage, various kinds of dynamics. But I think you answered your own question too when you were discussing this by allowing people to splinter off and to create their own iterations of what they view as the proper path for Zuzulu. And you're right. I don't think that they even all have to be necessarily crypto anarchic. I very much agree with Balaji that if we're focusing on a one commandment, if we're trying to solve a particular problem and we're working in the solution space, and then we have our own governance agreed upon and we share values, fine, let's do that and solve that problem. But then as long as we do have the crypto anarchist contingency, which I think we always are going to have those, it's going to work out. But even to your point, I think Moloch dynamics will have a tendency to emerge even in the most decentralized communities, because someone always will try to assert power. We just have to figure out governance mechanisms that we can put in place to minimize those powers. And luckily, with our technological advancement and our moral acumen and intuition that continues to grow as a species, right? Because we're constantly on a learning curve. We're always learning. We're always trying new things and innovating. I think that we'll continue to be able to innovate around and solve those problems. But I think at the end of the day, the point still stands that we are being heavily hamstrung by governmental agencies and vast bureaucratic apparatuses that attempt to subdue us from changing how we govern ourselves and how we work together. So even in these environments, in a macro environment where there's these predatory nation states, there's going to be that Molochian dynamic and influence that constantly infiltrates our communities. So always trying to work around that is going to be important. Anybody wants to learn about the consequences of this in fiction form, I always recommend reading Frank Herbert's books, right? Dune is all about the problems of leaderships, which ultimately is a problem of Molochian dynamics at play.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Did you want? Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Sure.
Hello.
Hi there.
Nice to meet you. I've been keeping an eye from quite a distance on Logos since I'm almost sure it was in Paris that there was an event on this beautiful gallery type venue where I first met. And although I see very different perspectives as experiment of a network state from Balaji's, and I find that great, as although very appreciative for the spread that Balaji's brought to the experiment, I do not, as one who thinks of networks, network states or parallel states in general, seeing networks as a very good way to do those. From way before the book. The book was inspirational, brought a lot of more people, smart people from different areas that think ideologically different than me, but have a lot to contribute to that search by their own reasons. His entrance brought more people into that discussion, which is a great advance. And earlier today, I asked him the same question I want to bring now. Just that's why I'm contextualizing. That is, there is a red line in our network state experiment, right? States are not bound to accept other things calling themselves states. They're not very historically, they don't seem historically a probability that they will just say like, oh, you guys are doing states, that's nice, keep going for it. We'll support you with our cables, with our electricity, with whatever that is needed, or with letting you guys walk free. Where do you see that red line? If you had one guess or three, what are the points where we cross that red line? What are the things that you see at this point that if we do, those are the escalation? Like if network states like, okay, we're doing this thing, this is likely when we're getting army invaded and going to jail, or police invaded if we don't even have our own police, like whatever it is. But at what point would you see that line?
Yeah, that's a good question, my friend. I think that it's hard to say, but I think that at any time that so once we start crowdfunding territory, which is already happening, right? Batalha, Rotan, etc. Those people that are there in a physical territory working together have the potential to be invaded by a nation state, even if they are not directly being crypto anarchic, right? We're all at risk always because governments control territories right now, right? In their own territory, and they've been doing it. They're going to continue to do that. So I think the line is actually super thin, my friend. Unfortunately, I think that even right now, without posing a direct threat, governments can potentially go after these guys, and if they don't go after them and try to throw them in prison, they're at least going to try to impose their regulatory regimes. They're going to impose their rules, etc. So now it probably begs the question, though, how do we combat that or fight back against that? So this is where I verge away a bit from Balaji's idea would be to just get diplomatic recognition, right? Where you're your own state and then they're unlikely to mess with you, right? And that's one path you could take. I'm of the path that we need to continue going the dark fi, the Amir Taki route, where we create this infrastructure that insulates us from being attacked, at least digitally first, right? And then the challenging part is if we want to crowdfund territory and want to come together, we have to figure out a place to do that where there's enough defenses in place politically and strategically that allows us to live out this experiment. And I think that the times are changing, the cultural ethos is shifting, the paradigm is shifting, where people are going to give more credence to experimentations in governance, and we're going to be allowed to do this because it's politically accepted, right? Because of change that's happening. That doesn't mean the government won't still try to stop or a government, right? Hypothetically, will still try to stop aspects of it. They very much can, but I think that it's inevitable that these spaces are going to arise and that they're going to be defended by other extant governments that exist right now, right? So I think there's going to be this competition space of governments that emerge that are first world, right? Even as it stands, just a side note, Switzerland is still very much a different form of governance, right? They use cantons. They're a mountainous terrain. They've been more neutral in a lot of ways. So spaces like that can emerge and they can last. That's not to say Switzerland is perfect by any stretch of the imagination or the crypto-anarchist dream, because it's not, but it just is an example of things that can potentially emerge. And I think it's going to get really interesting because of the technologies we're going to create are going to really heavily facilitate the creation of these network states, first digitally and then physically.
Can I bring a follow-up together?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to have the comparison because
Sure.
I want to make my words Balaji's, because I could not replicate exactly his answer.
Sure.
So, the nature of answers on these long conversations we have. But from my understanding, he brings an idea that a tech-focused state that is VC-backed, looking for a strategy that is first to try to do a startup society that goes unicorn, and from there learn the next steps, would be more cooperative with the current status quo of power, and so less likely to be seen as an enemy to attack, more as an ally. You see that this vision of maybe acquiring state or space through a VC-backed perspective of promise of returning profit is a viable strategy? Because in my first view on this is that it takes us to an extent, right? Like it takes us to some improvement, but I'm not sure that it changes the rules, the set of rules of the game on the long term in a way that matters for my most cared ideas. And I'm curious if you see that is still viable in a crypto-anarchist perspective, that start beginning on a VC-backed state, looking for profit, looking for bringing more money back into the valley or into the Bay or into New York or whatever it's settling. If that is a possible start that does turn into crypto-anarchist, or if that start is a no starter. If you start there, you can't really do the other thing. What do you think?
Yeah, it's really hard to say, because get this. Yes, I think for my knee-jerk or my gut reaction is to suggest that if you come from the VC-backed perspective, you're fully embedded in the state. Well, what that means by definition is that you're captured, right? Out of the gate, you're captured and you are now part of the status quo. You're part of the establishment. However, there is a perspective we could take where could operate as like a Trojan horse, right? Where you go the VC backed funding route, you get this set up, it's all sanctioned by the system and the establishment. But then people are like, oh, so they're experimenting with more freedom and it's working. So I'm always a huge fan of the idea that if we actually demonstrate that these technologies and these network states work in practice, more people will come into the fold, right? And it'll create a critical mass of individuals who want to join in. So I think there is hope from that perspective as a Trojan horse strategy that could be impactful if it's existing. And I think it will be alongside those of us who are a bit more aggressive like me, and probably like you were like, let's go the full crypto anarchy route. This is a purposeful design to undermine the state apparatus. Those are going to exist, but also the other stuff will exist as well. And I think it's possible that they could act as a Trojan horse, because at the end of the day, we just want a critical mass of people to try to experiment with these ideas and to be at least involved with network states to some extent. So I hope that that's helpful. I think it's possible.
It's a great answer. I just want to put one more very quick. I know we're past time a little bit. That is, on the my understanding of Logos sees the three pillars of different protocols in there, and I always think and keep saying that until we have the transatlantic or trans-Pacific cables or our own satellites, we're all playing with Lego bricks, and mommy might just tell us to put it back on the box at any point. At what point in the Nomos roadmap you see that having that level of sovereign infrastructure is necessary before it can be stopped? Or satellite? Let's not talk transatlantic cables. That's very hard. Satellite is not as far-fetched. Is
Right.
that some part of the conception, or that's beyond what can be looked so early?
Yeah, I don't think we're really focused on that at the moment. I mean, yes, there's going to be hardware and physical infrastructural concerns in terms of how much decentralization we can actually achieve. And I think that's always going to be a problem. But I do think that we're going to continue working in that direction. But for now, I can't really speak to Logos because our main concern is getting the tech out there first, because the technology that I discussed in my talk doesn't really exist yet. That's what we're all trying to work on to create a better infrastructural environment for applications that are not easily assailable can be created.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome, my man. Nice to meet you, brother.
Right. Thank you so much. And actually, there have been some conversations in recent days of what would it take to launch our own satellites. And there's a limited number of countries that have not yet signed the International Space Treaty, and apparently Georgia is one of them. And so that's sparked a little bit of a conversation, especially next week. We have a space track of, well, could it be possible? And there's some people here who have been researching that and are actually quite keen. So I think, it should still be somewhere on the roadmap in the larger cypherpunk network. We need the tech, and please, we're ready to use status. We're ready to use everything as soon as it's really viable. But that's where, if ideally we're all working in the same direction, then before it's too late, we already have our own satellites and we have those backup options. But this was really amazing. Thank you so much. It was fantastic to have you, and looking forward to further conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was amazing. I really enjoyed the time.